There's just a handful of us left, so we're going to have a very informal talk. You all heard the keynotes, which were full of lots of wisdom and great ideas, and covered extremely different topics. So the question is, how can we, put this together? But the panelists said there are two areas they'd like to talk about that they thought were common features. One is the question of sacred space and secular space, which they both kind of covered. And the other is they're both working, as are other people in this room, with digital humanities issues. And so we thought we might also dig into those issues as well. So, Ruthie, do you want to start with some? Or Joe, whichever of you wants to start.
Yeah, where exactly should we start?
The question of sacred and secular space, you said you were interested in talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, when thinking about connecting, one of the main things I'm working on now with this conference that became, because as we talked about in the Q&A, music, I mean, may play something of a role, but I think it will be not a very extensive one in the post-Shoah plays that I'm looking at. That could change if I start other things, but even if it does, I'll be coming to it as a theater historian and not a musicologist. But when I think about how to organize that project and how to tell that story, certainly the spaces in which those plays are set, and to some extent in spaces in which they're written, such as DP camps, becomes part of how I'm thinking about it. I mean, I think my main kind of writing project this summer will be writing a chapter that will be a paper at a conference next fall on plays set in the ghettos, which is something that I wanted to fit into the paper and there just wasn't space, but there's quite a few, including a real masterpiece by Slovis called 10 Brüder sind wir gewesen, the 10 brothers were we, that's set late in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and it has a kind of Beckettian feel almost. It's really wild. Leivich's play The Nessen Ghetto, which I alluded to. So thinking about that and looking at how these writers, one thing that's always interested me about Yiddish culture is you have, almost by definition, the people who are producing it have moved away from tradition to a greater or lesser extent, right? The same people were probably generations before they would have been expected to be rabbis and Talmud scholars, and some of them actually were, and some stay more traditional, some less so, some get into radical politics, but even a lifelong communist like Slovis or someone who had been a radical activist like Leivik, they're deeply tied to Jewish tradition, and I mean, Leivich's plays, as I talked about, something like the Chassan and Fernwald, and I only touched on this very briefly. It's complex, but it's filled with mysticism and textual allusions and things like that. So that question, like, even from someone who he's processing out as a theater person, as a poet, like what is our relationship with God, with our religious traditions, with our spirituality? That's running through all of these works.
Well, so what's happening is the secular space of the theater is being sacralized because the places they're showing us, the Warsaw Ghetto, now these places have this sacred quality automatically, kind of in an historical way, and in a post-religious way, become lieu de mémoire. They become sacred.
Yeah.
And so that is really interesting. That theater, as a secular institution, can produce a sacred space. That's not the synagogue.
Yeah, and there's always been an element of that. Of course, it comes up in this film clip. It comes up in lots of other ways, where obviously, we heard it in the film last night with so many quotations from liturgy. But also after the Shoah, there's an added dimension of that of, memorializing the victims, and Yiddish becoming, as well as Mama Loshen, it's Loshen Kedoshim, right? As sort of a play on Loshen Kodesh, it's the language of the martyred, and there's a kind of sacred responsibility of remembering and honoring those whom we've lost and everything that we've lost.
And it kind of cuts two ways. On the one hand, it foreshadows the enormous wave of physical memorials, which are still being built to this day around these issues. But on the other hand, we lost that sense that Yiddish was a core to a memorialization. It stopped being important anymore. And so that's in a way a little bit sad because, as you say, they're sanctifying Yiddish in a way at the time when it just becomes the stuff of comedy in post-vernacular, in the post-vernacular world. So there's an interesting kind of duality about this project, I find. But, say, Ruthie, what do you think?
I think that, Joel, our two presentations presented two foundational moments in a way for Yiddish theater to emerge out of a deep fracture and a deep rupture maybe of continuity. And so you're talking about post-Holocaust or even Holocaust plays in which theater emerges as a quite impressive, theater and drama, as you showed, as a quite impressive cultural force. Again, through Jewish expressive culture, and I talked about the beginning of Yiddish theater and the way they sort of navigate between tradition and continuity, and then also a sense of loss, profound change in the structure of society, in the structure of family, and also in the structure of ritual. I was thinking, sort of as a preparation for this closing remarks, so what can be the connection between the sacred, the secular, and the digital? And I was thinking that the emergence of Yiddish theater in 1876 pretty much correlates with the beginning of sound recording media. The phonograph is first registered, I think, in 1877. So these things happen together, and I think. I think about this question a lot, but what happens during that moment in which, the voice separates from the body and theater begins, and Jewish theater begins. And I think this is where the question of technology really enters. So the possibility of looking at tradition, whether it's a theatrical tradition or religious tradition, differently, through a different sort of body-voice construct.
Yeah, I mean, with the recording of cantors, this becomes a social issue in the Jewish world. Is this a good thing or not a good thing? And so they're thrust into a new kind of assessment of the materials that they have. But here you're dealing with well, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please.
No, dealing with the extremity of situation in which people have become voiceless, and you're voicing them, through drama, people who were extinguished or who are become effectively voiceless, is another, interesting way of dealing with this. And your work in voice is just so, foundational, I think, for considering this whole kind of area. But what was your connection, you said, with digital?
No, so I think this is maybe an opportunity also to begin the discussion about digital humanities and how do we deal with these materials today and sort of try to understand them today. But maybe Joel.
Carry on, and I'll jump in after.
So my endeavors in digital humanities, or my struggles, have been concentrated basically on two aspects, I think. One is producing tools, or trying to produce tools that will make Yiddish research easier. One of the things that we did in the beginning of the project is to transcribe hundreds of handwritten Yiddish plays from old prompting book from the Perlmutter collection. And from these shund, this trash material, so-called, we developed an OCR model that would automatically be able to read Yiddish. And this is open source, so anyone who wants to use the Dibuk model is, of course, invited. And anyone who wants to talk to me about how exactly to do that is invited. So this is one thing, sort of to use theater and to use sort of the playfulness of theater and of popular theater, and to sort of recycle these materials into new content and new tools that will help other scholars also deal with these materials. And the other thing is, of course, the database, which is, of course, also a huge endeavor, and we're sort of concluding this at the moment. And this has to do with like a systematic collection and registering and tagging of Schund plays, of basically the oeuvre of Joseph Latiner and Moshe Horvitz and their operettas, related sound recordings, sheet music, but also to record the field about them. So we were talking here about Zilbertzweig, and we also had some discussions about it, and there are so many contradictions within all these history books about dates, about facts. So what we decided we do in the database is just register everything. So not prioritize one source over another, but show the variety of and try also to produce some kind of validation system, which we usually do through the J-Press. So if it was written on in the press, then it probably happened. So I mean, that's like the premise.
No, this is really valuable, and of course you run the Digital Yiddish Theater project.
Yeah, along with Deborah. And Deborah and I started that over a decade ago now, and that came out of conversations that actually had on the back of a paper that Deborah gave at the AJS, where she was using GIS technology to track the different iterations of the Vilna troupe, and that started a long conversation in vestibule somewhere in the hotel that led to further conversations about how can we use DH technology tools and the people who have different kinds of expertise to tell aspects of the broader story of the Yiddish theater, which, as this film illustrates and a conference like this illustrates, no one person can do that. And it really takes people coming from, you have historians, and you have musicologists, and you have theater historians, and others who are all telling pieces of that story. And so, having the team in place and the tools, and one of the things that's just an ongoing challenge is finding, people carving out the time to be able to contribute to that. Of course, we've also turned to people like you, Mark, and many others, and to contribute to that story through a blog. And also, Ruthie and I talk from time to time just about our different projects, and neither of us is sort of formally affiliated with the other, but we know that we're kind of, we're like plowing neighboring fields, and we want to know what's going on the next field, and just have some of those conversations. Sometimes it's, hey, I just want to let you know this thing that we're working on. Sometimes it's, could you give us some advice? But there's, we have a great relationship with In Geweb, and in fact, we both just participated in fact, something on Schund, a special issue for In Geweb. So there's a lot of cross-pollination and fertilization there, and fortunately a lot of collegiality among these different projects, which is important.
And what's nice is that it's happening everywhere. So I'm more familiar with the projects in the Yiddish folk song and in klezmer and in instrumental music, which are become completely digital now, and trying to be cutting edge and trying to, again, to create an umbrella. So here is all the stuff. And then we can then figure out what to do when we have all this stuff. And it's just remarkable for me to see the arc of this, because, I kept using this metaphor for years that all we have are crumbs from the banquet of Yiddish culture, but now we have like much more of the banquet is available. We're reconstructing the dishes, and the china and the silver, like we're setting the table in a way that we couldn't before, from which we can then do a different kind of work. And so I think this quantitative stuff ends up with qualitative results when we can change the kind of work that we can actually do when we have so much more to deal with. And the issue you're raising is really important, because these projects I'm talking about are not interfacing with your project and your project yet. So all these projects need to be under, of course, there's no super umbrella over all of this, but it would be nice if there were, so that they could all speak to each other, at least in terms of the technologies you're using, what are you using, and then in terms of the philosophy.
Well, that probably needs to be, seriously, that probably needs to be a conference at some point.
Yeah, there needs to be a conference where, the people representing these different wings of this project, all of which have to do with what we're talking about as, Eastern European Jewish expressive culture, could come together and in a sense would have a lot of power, I think, if it were brought together more.
So I'll just say that Mark and I had a panel in the previous Jewish Studies Congress in Jerusalem. Is that?
Yes, World Congress of Jewish Studies.
Exactly. In which we sort of started thinking about the idea of sort of linking digital Jewish performance studies, basically, that will sort of bring together various projects
really
and talk about linkage.
Right. Can I add something about the sort of that, that approach that you described, Ruthie, which I think is really important of not, there are other times we can prioritize and select, but just putting everything out there is so valuable because in a way, like there's, as much as we do know, there's so much that we actually don't know about, and also that there are narratives that sort of take hold, and those narratives always need to be challenged. One way that we're a sort of version of that for us is an initiative that's called Plotting Yiddish Drama, which we started a couple years ago. It's a database of tagged and searchable plot synopses of Yiddish plays. It's a relatively modest body of plays so far of something like 60 synopses, and that's, it's so significant, but we want to grow it much larger. An invitation to send to all of you, for example, the play that you talked about the other night, if you are, have something like that handy, a play that you're working on, because it's any kind of Yiddish play. We're not just doing the Gordons and the Leiviks, it's operettas, it's Schund, it's one acts, it's full lengths. Whether it was known or not, we want to collect those, those synopses, and we have a certain sort of approach to that, which we can talk to you about. But we would love to just, we do have some of us have generated a lot of them, but there are people working on all kinds of things that are far flung. And it's impossible for, the 14, 15 of us to get to all of them. So by all means, write to me and we'd love to include those things.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's such a valuable pedagogical resource, the synopsis, I find. For my students, it was really helpful.
Well, actually part of we already, I think either we had launched or we were working on it, but I was having a conversation years ago with Hasia Diner, and she asked me something about a certain type, I don't know, it was peddlers or whatever in Yiddish plays, and I was thinking, that's exactly like the kind of, it's for other people working on Yiddish theater, but for people like Hasia or for, any of you, if you're looking for that sort of thing, or I want to search, plays that are set in, where there's something, the part of the plot is in Eretz Yisrael, or there's something about pogroms or whatever it might be, that that it can be used for so many different kinds of things. And also, back to Mark's question about Mark Kligman's question about pedagogy of use in the classroom too.
Well, as the dramatic arc of this conference is drawing to a close, I've been asked to ring down the curtain with a few thoughts of about the final thoughts about the conference. So I guess we have to move on. But thank you so much.
Thank you.